What is politics? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is politics? The standard definition of politics is the art and science of governing. And I think that's sufficient to begin. So I think in order to figure out what politics is, we should begin at the origin of humanity, where we're hunter-gatherers and we're loosely forming sociological units. Essentially, at that time, just figuring out survival clusters. Very utilitarian, still very much being formed by nature itself, still in line with the forces of natural selection as outlined by Darwin, going through the environment, going through nature, both collecting data for the Homo sapien consciousness and finding out how to survive in it, how to catalog things, how to label things, how to create language, and then all of these factors as these units go through reality itself, both on the physical level and these higher levels of metaphysical levels and consciousness levels. They rapidly get to a point where the sociological unit that's based on utility of physical reality, when they start to get routines and find routines that make it so that they feel like they have some security in surviving the reality to some degree, they can start engaging in short, mid, and long-term planning. And with the advent of this consciousness that develops within the sociological units, when they've established some sort of survival ability, survival stability within the reality, then it becomes apparent that they're going to have to develop a management system based on the survival techniques that they've established. And at that time, it was probably as simple as they found shelter, they found sufficient shelter, they found sources of fresh water, and they found sources of food. And then that probably turned into sources of medicine. And then they figured out ways to discern, weather, changes in the reality, changes in the water, the food stock, vegetation, predators, prey, the whole thing, right? And so then they get bonded to the earth, and then perhaps spiritual metaphysical practices evolve, and perhaps even in those nomadic times, maybe they kept wandering between different sites, or they got to a point where the leadership was able to see what the underlying fundamental principles were involved with those survival structures, and then they felt confident to be able to roam to different areas and simply identify the survival features of an area, whether topographically or through whatever senses they developed. It could be whatever. I'm sure it was dependent on each different clan, each different cluster developed differently. And then at some point, while they're doing this, they join forces with other clans or clusters, or they find an area where the dawn of their consciousness says, okay, this is a place. Now that we've had some places where we've camped for periods of time or whatever, and then they're starting to figure out a notion of time, that time becomes intricately related to their ability to stock food, have fresh water, survivability, and not be predated. Then they get this sense of time that's related to their survival, which becomes very practical. And then at a certain point, they just say, well, this looks like an area that exceeds the time limit of what we can think about. So why maybe we stay here? And at that moment, when they say, why maybe we stay here, and the cluster or clan agrees on it, and they set up shop and they create a settlement, or they create a living area that they intend to stay there indefinitely, then all of the practices and all of the management techniques that they've been using to govern themselves start to get codified. Now, of course, that requires language, communication, agreements, all these things. A consensus needs to be formed and sent up to the leadership, whether it's at that point probably a chieftain or whoever the leaders of the hunting packs are. And then as that grows, the leaders of the hunting pack or the chieftains eventually start having counsel for subject matter experts in the different fields, whether those fields be spiritual counsel or hunting counsel or medicine counsel, or perhaps like the head female is, you know, in charge of like domestic activities and birthings and keeping everybody abreast on, like, you know, food stocks or whatever it is. That's what makes anthropology wildly entertaining, because you can see how these things develop in time, and how, even though they're super different throughout areas of the planet, they're also extremely similar because they're addressing the same factors. Now, at a certain point in there, everybody gets wise to the fact that these things in these processes need to be codified, because they're organically creating systems of survival and systems of management for the group. And at that point, when people realize that and it becomes self-aware, then it becomes politics. Because now it becomes the business of surviving. And that's the base level. As it moves on, it becomes the business, the art, and the science of governing themselves for abundance. And then all these other higher needs and requirements begin to come in as everyone gets comfortable in successive generations of, oh, well, we can survive here. It doesn't even become a question anymore. In fact, they have even forgotten about the fact that the sociological unit they're living in has provided a solution to survival. Because 3, 4, 5 generations deep into being born inside this bubble of survival that they call society or civilization, only perhaps the DNA memory of, you know, their great-great-great-grandparents walking around from camp to camp or area to area and trying to figure out survival even remains. It's not in the front of their mind anymore. So at that point, those survival instincts get placed onto the leadership of their political class. And that political class gets codified as they are in charge of managing survival. And since survival seemingly has been achieved indefinitely, then in like the hierarchy of needs scenario, now that the bottom levels of the hierarchy of needs have been satisfied, the other psychological needs of humanity begin to emerge. And those psychological needs include wish fulfillment, fantasy, very baroque requirements to satisfy the human consciousness. They want to know more, they want to do more, they want to be pleased more, they want to experience more, they want to have abundance. These things that were not even a thought to the hunter-gatherers because they were so preoccupied in the moment with survival. And so now the original political class, which had evolved out of only managing basic survival, now has the management duty of getting into the higher levels of the human consciousness and managing the higher levels of the human consciousness. And at that point, and I covered this in a previous video about what is justice, then they have to start getting into the real power of what modern day politics is and what the main requirement and expectation of politicians is, which is justice. And as we covered, justice is powered by morality. Justice is the act of putting someone in a morally correct state. And in the case of politics, politics is the job of using the group's resources, all the resources, physical, moral, spiritual, mental, everything, in a variety of different ways. And like I said, watch my video on what is justice to see where I break it down. it is the job of the politicians to create and manage justice for the individuals that they are overseeing. It is their job to make sure that individuals are put in a state of moral correctness. It's not a job of politicians to put the group at the expense of any individuals in a state of moral correctness. That is incorrect, and that is the fundamental flaw with many flawed political theories. Organically developing politics mandates that the job of those engaged in politics, who are politicians, is to put the state of each and every individual into a state of moral correctness. And all of their actions and policies necessarily need to be in harmony with that. And they have been entrusted with the most sacred resources of the society in order to do that. Now, political theory, which is a subset of politics, deals with all the different manner of systems of managing and governing that one can think of. And they obviously range the entire spectrum, and there's a bunch of different reasons for it. And people have written all kinds of treatises about it. You know, probably the most famous cynical one is Machiavelli's The Prince, where he talks about basically the political class disguising themselves and hiding themselves of any real public duty, and essentially resolving it down to personal power grabs while hiding in the political class, like a sick game of chess, which is what went on in feudal Europe or monarchistic Europe forever. And we see what the results of those were. It's not good. And then we see, much more idealistic theories, or seemingly idealistic theories. When someone promises a paradise in the political science realm, it's usually a con job, because the main analysis to do in terms of political theory, I can't go into every single political theory. Maybe I'll do different videos on the different political theories. But the main thing to analyze a political theory with is the fact that a politician's main job is to facilitate and administrate justice for the individual. Like the United States' mandate for politicians really is the tagline, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what politicians are supposed to be managing the resources of the United States of America for the individual. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And other nations have other ethoses, like Costa Rica says pura vida, pure life, right? And the communist China, it's the exact opposite. It's abdicate individual rights and make sure that the collective has the optimum output, and government officials are beyond reproach. So, in the sense of like the CCP, they've completely abdicated all sense of the individual. But when you analyze political theory, politics, which are the art and science of governing, have a mandate, and that mandate is to provide justice for the individual, because it goes back to the organic evolution of politics, which is human sociological units finding a way to survive, finding survival, and then managing the continuation of survival, and then adjudicating the moral energy and the resources that are derived from that moral energy and the resources that are derived from the group to ensure quality of life for the individual over which they're governing. And any deviation from that is, well, the history books are filled with that. And that's really what the story of any sort of power grab is. If somebody's in the political class and they're not doing their job, any sort of power grab that is anything but trying to facilitate the quality of life of the individuals over which they're governing, or for whom they are governing is a better way to put it, that's a dereliction of duty in terms of the philosophy of politics. But the practicality of politics is an entirely different thing, as we all know and we're all familiar with. So I think that's a decent coverage, right? Like here, you know, what is politics? The art and science of managing and governing. So I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. And